Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers, Florida. We are reissuing the Revelation series that was taught by Rabbi Jim Pickens here at Beth Yeshua over the course of the last 2 years or so. We feel these messages are especially relevant in these tumultuous times, and we hope and pray that Adonai uses them to strengthen you and to encourage you. If you are currently a supporter of this ministry, we would like to say thank you. We appreciate your partnership with us as we all labor together in the work of the gospel of Yeshua in the kingdom here on earth. If you would like to support us, you will find a link below in the video description. Once again, we hope that this is a blessing to you. If you have any questions, you will find an email address. If you have any dialogue or discussion, you'll find an email address in the video description below. Please reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. And now I will give you the Revelation series with Rabbi Jim Pickens. Shalom.
Well, Chag Sameach, everybody. We're going to start this evening with setting up the base, continuing to set up the base for a better understanding of the book of the Revelation. All the stuff we're studying in Daniel, that we're going to study in Zechariah, that we're going to look at in Matthew chapter 24 in a few weeks, is laying a base out so we can better understand the book of the Revelation when we get there, because the book of the Revelation doesn't start in Revelation chapter 1. The book of the Revelation, some parts of it started almost 2,000 years ago. They've been underway that long. Some of them haven't gotten around to yet, but the actual information and material we need to understand it was written down in the Torah and the prophets and the writings of the Old Testament. So tonight we're going to get into the vision of Nebuchadnezzar that was the first given indication of the times of the Gentiles starting. Times of the Gentiles, Yeshua refers to in Matthew, we'll give you a scripture in a few minutes, as a time when God is dealing on a level with the Gentile world in a way that he hadn't dealt with prior to the start of the time of the Gentiles. I want us to look at this time of the Gentiles to kind of begin with, because it begins with the start of the Babylonian Empire, and we're going to be in second year of Nebuchadnezzar. Throw that up there, that chart up there. Some of you have seen this chart if you were at the men's Bible study after Shabbat this past Saturday. We passed one of those around, but you see that statue down there on the end. That's a vision that we're going to look at in chapter 2 of Daniel that we're going to spend some time with this evening. But just a quick look at it, a quick run through this. This is a statue that Nebuchadnezzar had a dream about. And it had a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of clay. And we're going to get really into dealing with that on a kind of a greater ongoing basis, if you will. It shows us how, when we break it down, it shows us how Adonai Elohim is actually in charge of everything that happens from that dream until we get to the end of the age. That is an image that is projecting that for us. And this is going to be projected to us in great detail. Adonai Elohim is going to take man through history, through all of history, controlling both Israel and the Gentiles. So let's go ahead, if you can give this to me, pick this up in Daniel chapter 2. Verses 1 through 3. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar became so troubled by a series of dreams that he couldn't sleep. So the king ordered, and look at this list, the magicians, exorcists, sorcerers, and astrologers summoned to interpret the king's dream to him. See who he's calling to have his dreams interpreted? People that are projected out. Their base is Satan. Their base is Hasatan. And they came and stood in his presence, and the king said to them, I had a dream which will keep troubling my spirit until I know what it means. Well, I'm going to digress from this for just a second to establish a custom of the period for us to think of. No matter what part of the year that a king was installed, his reign began officially from the start of that year. If he was crowned in the 11th month of the year, that whole year counted as his first year of reign. That was the typical thing that was going on in that era where Nebuchadnezzar was crowned king. Even if serving for only 1 month of the year, that whole year counted. He got credit for the whole year. Now, it figured that Nebuchadnezzar here probably wasn't installed as king on Nisan 1st. We're going to be dealing with the lunar calendar. Nisan 1st is the first month on God's lunar calendar. He had himself crowned as soon as he hit town, as soon as he got back from his sacking of Jerusalem. So that first year of his reign probably wasn't a full 12 months. And from secular writings, we know that's to be actually true, that he took the throne in September of 605 BC. So his first year of king was really only about 6 months. And if he became king in September, then he became king about the same time as the Jews that he just sacked and burned their temple and everything should have been celebrating the fall feasts. So we'll tie into that later on in the study. Now, his top priority here wasn't getting these captive boys of Israel that he brought back with him after he sacked Jerusalem, getting their schooling set up. That wasn't his top priority in that first 6 months or so. He had to get his hold on his throne solidified first before he could get into anything. That was his number one priority, and certainly would have used up probably all of that first 6 months or so. Our passage here, chapter 2 and verse 1, tells us that Nebuchadnezzar had this dream in the second year of his reign, and that would have been fairly early in the training period that was going on with Daniel and the other three boys who were all royal princes that had been brought back as captives. In fact, verse 13 indicates that Daniel and the three others weren't in the group that got called in to meet with Nebuchadnezzar here, indicating they probably hadn't been in training long enough for their abilities to begin to show to their teachers. In this step-on-your-face society that Babylon was at that time, if the talents of these four boys were clearly visible, they had any really special talents, these teachers would have sent word up to make themselves look important. Look at how good we are, Look at how great our students are doing under our teaching. And this shows us early on that sometime in the first 18 months of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, God began to exercise his sovereignty over the Gentiles, because he gave Nebuchadnezzar this dream, and there's going to be a sorting out that is from the hand of God. God immediately began to intervene in the king's rule, King Nebuchadnezzar's rule in Babylon. He gave him this dream that upset him. Let's look for a minute at Daniel chapter 2, verse 4, please. The astrologers, that's all these men that got called in by the king, spoke to the king in Aramaic. May the king live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it. Well, the astrologers spoke to the king in Aramaic is written in Hebrew. But that's the last thing written in Hebrew. From that point on through the end of chapter 7, the text of Daniel is all written in Aramaic. So why? why would this have all been written in Aramaic? Well, ask the question, why was the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah, translated into the Greek? Because the Greek was the international language of the time of the New Testament's translation from Aramaic into Greek. Everybody then throughout that whole Mediterranean area could read it, both Jew and Gentile. Because to do business, you had to be able to speak Greek. To be able to do a number of things, you had to be, so it became a second language for everybody. Same rule applies in Daniel's time here. Under the Babylonian Empire, Aramaic became the international language, so that everybody, in theory, could communicate, could read, both Jew and Gentile. And they would be able to read then what is said from here on in Daniel. It was a common business language as well as a diplomatic language. Anywhere in any of the provinces of Babylon, if you knew Aramaic, you could do business, you could do government work. And we need to take note that from chapter 2 through chapter 7, the book of Daniel deals with Adonai's rule over the Gentiles, and it says it all in Aramaic so that they should be able to understand it. These chapters were written in a language that this empire's Gentiles could understand. I'm harping on this. Had the information been written in these chapters in Hebrew, the message would have been missed. Jews would have gotten it, but missed for the most part by the Gentiles. And at that time and after that, Adonai didn't want anybody missing it. At that time, he wanted everybody to hear it, so he purposely put it in a language that the Gentiles could read. So much for this being a dispensation where God didn't deal with the Gentiles. You'll hear that teaching, I'm sure, before you're home residing with the man himself. In verse 1, note that Nebuchadnezzar's dreams are stated in the plural. It's like, are there a number of dreams? Stern interprets this as a series of dreams. Was this a series of dreams out of which there was one that troubled him? Or was it the same dream over and over and over and over in a series? I think the latter, but that's my opinion. The term troubled indicates the king was disturbed to the point of apprehension. He was disturbed to the point where he could no longer sleep. So he comes in and he summons all of those that he thinks can give him information to help run the empire. Magicians, sorcerers, exorcists, astrologers. In this group would have been those that would have been labeled enchanters, demonists, those who communicated with the dead, diviners of all kinds, those with crystals that they could read, those with scrolls. Think about this now, because we're going to do a little adventure here. Those with scrolls which contain prescribed formulas and incantations designed to produce the effect of communicating with the nether region to get information to interpret what was going on in the world. Scrolls like the ones that were burned in Ephesus in Acts chapter 19, verse 13 through 16. Would you put that up, please? Thank you. Then some of the Jewish exorcists who traveled from place to place tried to make use of the name of the Lord Yeshua in connection with people who had evil spirits. And they would say, I exorcise you by the Yeshua that Shaul, Paul, is preaching. And one time, 7 sons of a Jewish Cohen, that's a Jewish Cohen Gadol, Jewish high priest named Sceva, were doing this. Next. And the evil spirit answered them, the one that was in the man, answered them and said, Yeshua, I know. And Shaul, Paul, I recognize, but who are you? Who are you? Then the man with the evil spirit fell upon them, overpowered them, and gave them such a beating that they ran from the house naked and bleeding. Think God's hand might not have been in that? This is during a time of Paul's ministry, and these were occultists who were faking that their practices were legitimate forms of ministry in the name of Yeshua. Practices still hanging on from the time of Babylon, from the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Practices that will hang on until the end of the era known as the times of the Gentiles, even though these here were obviously Israelis that were doing this. This aggravated Adonai, so he loosed the demon controlling the man that on them. That was one thing. But look at the result. Acts 19:17, please. When all this became known to the residents of Ephesus that this had happened, and of course there was no television to watch, no movies to go to, so word spread pretty quickly and stories got told. When all this became known to the residents of Ephesus, fear fell on them, Jews and Greeks alike, and the name of the Lord Yeshua came to be held in high regard. Many of those who had earlier made professions of faith now came and admitted publicly their evil deeds. Next. And a considerable number of those engaged in occult practices threw their scrolls in a pile and burned them in public. What was their scrolls all about? Same thing as the scrolls that were being used in Nebuchadnezzar's time. They contained formulas and stuff that you could use to bring demons forth so you could bounce questions off of them. When they calculated the value of these scrolls, it came to 50,000 drachmas. Thus, the message about the Lord continued in a powerful way to grow in influence. Fantastic, isn't it? And there were all kinds of scrolls being used by Nebuchadnezzar. These were the same kind of scrolls being used by Nebuchadnezzar's advisors. Thing is, though, it not only had continued until then, but it has continued into our modern times as well. We don't think about stuff like that. Not in our modern world today. Why would people do that? See, God is telling us all these things about Babylon. He's telling us all these things about Babylon so that we can see the basis of this empire, because we have a Babylon condition continually. We have a Babylon condition right now, today in the world. And because we have this, we need to look for it. We need to see things that are going on with it and are about it. See, it's much more prevalent than most of us think. Modern governments do consult these kinds of entities, and so do large corporations. Think about that. So do large corporations. Do any of us remember when Nancy Reagan got caught having had a seer in the White House? Anybody? Yeah, I thought some of you would. I'm going to read you something here from Time magazine. It's dated Monday, May 16th, 1988. It says, when the news broke last week that Nancy Reagan regularly consulted a woman astrologer about the president's schedule, reporters immediately scrambled to discover this mysterious seer's identity. Who was this friend from San Francisco who had so much influence in determining what the president of the U.S. would or would not hold press conferences, deliver speeches, journey abroad? In other words, conduct himself. That's my ad lib. Not even Donald Reagan, whose new book tells of the First Lady's reliance on the seer, he didn't learn this answer until his 2 years as White House Chief of Staff were over. So we've got these things still going on in the world today, not only in governments, but in business. Satan is able to control a large segment of the population because they're reaching out to him through these various things. And we once in a while run into a classic example like this. Now, back to our story. All of these advisors that Nebuchadnezzar called were really a sum total of satanic power. A sum total of satanic power that the king officially had at his disposal. And it was the king's hope that one, or some, or maybe all of them, or any combination thereof, could interpret his dream. Here the word for dream is singular, indicating that only one of his dreams, or a repetitive single one, was really prophetically significant for us. He knew that this dream was prophetically significant. It troubled him in his spirit, and he had to know it. He had to know what it meant to have peace of mind. So back in Daniel 2, let's look in verses 4 through 6. The astrologers spoke to the king in Aramaic. May the king live forever. Tell us your servants the dream, and we will interpret it. And the king answered the astrologers, here's what I've decided. If you don't tell me both the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb and your houses reduced to rubble. Yeah, that's kind of throwing the brick. But if you do state the dream and its interpretation, I will give you presents, rewards, and great honor. Just tell me the dream and its interpretation. Wow. Isn't that something? Two things. They first were required to tell him what his dream was, and then to interpret it. Now, can we see the hand of God in this? This was a test. This was a test. And there are a couple of things going on in that test. First of all, the king is setting down a challenge to his wizards. If you're so good, if you're in such touch with the gods, then you should be able to not only interpret the dream, you should be able to tell me what the dream was. The other thing that's being shown us here is that the demonic world can't read our minds. The demonic world can't read our minds. Unless man verbalizes his thoughts, demons don't know what's going on in their heads. Keep that in mind when you're yakety-yakety-yakking about something. These wise men of Babylon, and I'm using the term collectively, couldn't find out what was going on from their gods because God had put the dream in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, and Nebuchadnezzar didn't say out loud what the dream was. And these wise men of Babylon generally had an easy job. The king would give them information to interpret. They would give him an answer because they had help from the demonic world that was directing the empire of Nebuchadnezzar. Here was a new challenge, a subject that only Adonai and Nebuchadnezzar knew had to be named by them before it was interpreted, and these seers, demonic coaches, didn't know what it was, had no clue. The rewards could be great, but the penalty's horrific. Torn limb from limb meant hook a camel up to each arm and leg and drive off in 4 different directions. Life was cheap in Babylon. This also gives you a glimpse of how Satan takes care of his own. As soon as he has no use for his own, he discards them. Hitler was a great example in our modern days of Satan was through with him, he's gone. When Satan had no greater use for them, they were torn apart. They would be torn limb from limb, not cut. Cutting would have been nice. And their houses made rubble, this tells us. The language has a connotation, when you read it in the Aramaic, has a connotation that public restrooms would be erected over the rubble of their houses so that they would also be defiled in that particular way. The defilement would be absolutely every way it could be done. But the rewards, if they could do this, would be great. So here was a supreme test of their superhuman claims. If they had supernatural power to interpret the dream, they would also, in his mind, have supernatural power to state the dream itself. But they couldn't. Verses 7 through 9, please. A second time that's the servants of Satan, said, let his majesty tell his servants the dream, and we will interpret it. The king replied, I see you're only trying to gain some time because you see that I've decided that if you don't tell me the dream, there's only one sentence passed on all of you. So you've conspired to mislead me with lies in the hope that time will change things. Now just tell me the dream. That will convince me that you will also be able to give me its correct interpretation. These guys are trying to borrow a little more time. Nebuchadnezzar recognized that one. I can see them standing looking at each other with like palms up, eyes wide open, you know. Expressions really of panic on their faces. But the king is on them. Quit stalling. Quit stalling. Just tell me the dream. Just tell me the dream. And he ups the ante. Ups the ante. If one of you doesn't come up with the dream correctly, all of you will suffer the penalty. Because I think you'd all conspire against me. Would make up lies to give yourselves time to figure something out. The only way I'll believe any interpretation that you would give me is if you can tell me the dream first. Now tell me the dream. And that's a key. He's going to have to be told by whoever interprets it what the dream is before they give the interpretation if he's going to believe that it's accurate. Verses 10 through 13, please. The astrologers answered the king, Your Majesty, nobody in the world can do this. Never has a king, no matter how great or powerful, asked such a thing of any magician or exorcist or astrologer. The king is asking a difficult thing. Nobody but the gods could tell this to your majesty, and they don't live with mere mortals. At this, the king flew into a rage and ordered all the sages of Babel put to death. When the decree was published that the sages were to be slain, they sought Daniel and his companions in order to have them put to death as well. See, these sages, going back to the top of the passage here, are really crawfishing now. They're backing, they're filling, they're getting in the king's face a little bit too. Say, they're telling him no great king has ever asked such a thing of their sages. This is too difficult. Only the gods could answer this, and they don't live with mere mortals. In other words, they weren't getting anything through their demon pipeline about this dream. Now the king was told to his face, You're unreasonable. No great king ever asked such a thing. The inference here is, if you want to be considered a great ruler, don't you? Don't you want to do that? If you want that, then don't demand this. No great king has ever done this before. Now, the king belonged to a class of men of the Chaldeans, and these astrologers were trying to say that this was inconsistent with being in that class that he was in. Didn't work. In fact, it got them an immediate death sentence. Immediate death sentence. This episode tells us something very important. These men were in touch with the demonic spirit world, and the demonic spirit world could not tell them the dream. What the dream was, the subject of the dream, had been only between God and Nebuchadnezzar. The only access to that dream for the demons was Nebuchadnezzar. And they could not look into his mind as long as he kept his mouth shut. The demons could gain no knowledge. As the children of God, bearing his mark, the thing we need to take away from all this is that our thoughts are between us and God. Our thoughts are to be between ourselves and God. Nobody or no thing has any access to our thoughts until we verbalize them. We broadcast them out across the earth. The demonic world can't read our minds. God does not allow access to the heart or the soul of man except for himself. In the demon world, if the demon world had that ability, they would have been able to look into the king's mind and pass the information along to the soothsayers. Nebuchadnezzar figures for sure that they're conspiring against him, been duping him all this time, and he goes ballistic. Orders immediate death by quartering of all the Babylonian sages, including the trainees. including the 4 princes, Daniel and the other 3 boys that were brought in from the siege of Jerusalem. So they come looking for Daniel and his companions to put him to death. Evil is rarely logical. Let's look in Daniel, still in Daniel 2, verses 14 through 16, please. Then choosing his words, after he's been threatened, then choosing his words carefully, Daniel consulted with Arioch, captain of the royal guard, who had already gone out to kill the sages of Babylon. He said to Arioch, "Since you're the king's official, let me ask, why has the king issued such a harsh decree?" And Arioch explained the matter to Daniel. Then Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time to tell the king the interpretation. Look at that verse 16. Daniel just got up and walked into the king and asked the king to give him time to tell the king the interpretation. Arioch would have served as the king's chief executioner because of his position of the captain of the king's royal guards. He wouldn't have done it himself. But he'd been responsible for having it done. And Daniel seems to have interrupted Arioch in carrying out his orders, speaks to him in wisdom and in tact, God-given qualities that he had, wisdom and tact, and asks what's going on. And Arioch, who's already impressed with Daniel because he's seen how Daniel and the boys are living, how that has progressed them in their training and everything. Arioch explains it to Daniel, who is then allowed to approach the king and ask the king for time so that he, Daniel, could give the king the answer that he was seeking. Now you consider, why would Daniel go charging in front of the king, which was not allowed? Well, he had 2 options, he and the other 3 boys, all of whom were faithful to God, could have allowed themselves to be put to death as part of the body of seers and diviners of Babylon, or they could be put to death for attempting to be God's servants by charging in and bullying the king a little bit, doing God's will, if you will. That's the options in their mind. It's a no-brainer. In any given situation, you always seek God and place yourself in His hands. Well, consider whose sovereign hand was in this. God has again set up a situation where He would prove to be sovereign over both the Jews in captivity and the Gentiles. Verse 12 says that the king was in a rage. The king was in a rage. Probably not a lot of reasonable thinking going on here with the king. Add this to that to go before the king unannounced and uninvited brought a death sentence. Daniel had little to lose at this point. He had a death sentence either way. If he was going to go out, he was going to go out seeking God, but it didn't look real promising. Remember, the king was in a rage. And Daniel was at this point one of the seers, and far as the king's mind is concerned, because he was in training to become one of them. Remember the book of Esther? Book of Esther, if you don't remember, come to Purim. We're going to read the Megillah. Esther feared going before the king, asked for 3 days of complete fast and of both food and water and prayer before she would go before the king unannounced and uninvited. And she was queen. She was queen. And the king liked her. Daniel not only was given an audience, he was given time to interpret the dream according to the king's conditions. On Daniel's part, this was an act of sheer faith and trust in God, a point we always need to consider, that when we're faced with these obstacles, we need to always have sheer faith and trust in our God. You see, Daniel put himself in this position before he came before God in prayer. He just jumped into this, just ran to the king before he even consulted God. Daniel had complete confidence in God, having more than just a little faith in God. He had such a faith in God, he knew God would take care of him. verses 17 through 18, please. Daniel went home and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, so that they could ask the God of heaven for mercy during this secret and concerning this secret, and thus save Daniel and his companions from dying along with the other sages of Babylon. Now, the first thing that Daniel did was rally the troops. Rallied the troops before God. These other three were the ones that Daniel knew and trusted as being faithful to God. And they sought the mercies of God and the compassion of God in prayer. And these four boys, frankly, were in a desperate situation. Their lives were at stake, but they didn't panic. They prayed. Another instruction for us. And as we know from James chapter 5, verse 16, the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. Verse 19, please. Then the secret was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Aha! God came through. The secret of what had been the dream was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. And Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And in these words he said, "Blessed be the name of God from eternity past to eternity future." He's talking about the whole swipe that God's doing. For wisdom and power are his alone. He brings the changes of season and the times. He installs and deposes kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those with discernment. Next. He reveals deep and secret things. He knows what lies in the darkness, and light dwells with him. I thank and praise you, God of my ancestors, for giving me wisdom and power and revealing to me what we wanted from you, for giving us the answer for the king. Now, we tend to want to think of Daniel as being this mature, responsible man of God, but understand that Daniel was less than 20 years old at this time. He was a teenager. Boy, we look around at teenagers today and we wonder how many of them would jump up and grab this. The secret was revealed to Daniel in a vision at night. Text is very specific about that. Visions are different from dreams in that a person is awake when they receive a vision. They're focused. They're on top of it. Adonai came overnight and gave Daniel the answers that he needed. The important thing is the vision came from God, who is also the author of the king's dream. And Daniel had access to the one who knew the dream and its meaning. The wizards of Babylon had access to those who know nothing about the private things between God and man. Daniel immediately blesses God. First phrase revealing the nature of God, the recognition of what God was. The Babylonian deities supposedly merely set the seasons by movement of the sun, moon, and stars. Our God changes the season. He makes them happen. God sets kings and national leaders in place, and he disposes of them. He just gave us Donald Trump as an example. Adonai is someone who has absolute power to do whatever he wants. God is the author of history, therefore he can reveal the future. And he's doing it here. The light dwells with him. Even the darkness must reveal what is in it to him. Think about that. The darkness must even reveal to God what is in it. Daniel says the answer for the king is given us. His prayer partners are equal in this thing to him in his own eyes is given to us. Verses 24 through 28. So Daniel went to see Arioch, whom the king had charged with destroying the sages of Babylon, and said to him, "Don't destroy the sages of Babylon. Bring me before the king, and I will give the king the interpretation." Quickly Arioch brought Daniel before the king and told him, and follow this because it's interesting. He says, "I have found one of the exiles of Judah who will reveal the interpretation to his majesty." Next. The king said to Daniel, who had been renamed Belshazzar, "Can you tell me what I dreamt and what it means?" And Daniel answered the king, No sage, exorcist, magician, or astrologer can tell his manual the secret he is asked about. But there is a God in heaven who unlocks mysteries, and he has revealed to Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the Akhirit Hayamin, the end of the age. Here are your dream and visions that you had in your head when you went to bed. Wow. Daniel goes to Arioch and instructs him not to execute the wise men of Babylon. The wizards were probably being rounded up and brought in at that time, and Daniel has the chutzpah. I mean, this has the chutzpah to run up to the king's guards and say, "Stop! Don't do what you're supposed to be doing that the king ordered." Well, the chief executioner is told, "Don't kill them yet." See, God was again giving Daniel favor with a man who held the power of life and death over him. God's hand was definitely upon this. POWs just don't order their captors around. See, this wasn't a segment of Hogan's Heroes that was being played out here. Arioch believed Daniel when he said he could meet the requirements of the king for this interpretation. Consider that Arioch was going out on a limb here. You know, he was risking a whole bunch. He could have simply executed everybody and had a king that was pleased with him for obeying the orders, but he took a chance on the king blaming him for deviating from orders if anything went wrong here. That was a potentially deadly situation for him. But he quickly brought Daniel before the king. Now listen to how Arioch presents this to the king. I have found, see, he wanted credit for this if it works out. I have found one of the exiled Jews who will reveal the interpretation to your majesty. He certainly wanted to be on the bandwagon, wanted some of the glory. On the other hand, it tells us of confidence he had in Daniel because he was willing to stick his neck out this far. Tells us something of Daniel that he could inspire this kind of confidence in someone. Tells us something about the lifestyle Daniel led that was unlike anything that the Babylonians had seen before, and it witnessed to them and gave them confidence in him. And it tells us how God is at work in the lives of these two men. God's at work in the lives of these two men, one a faithful Jew, the other a pagan Gentile. Through the unwavering faith of Daniel, again a testimony to the sovereign action of God, God is able to work in the lives, through the unwavering faith of Daniel, in the lives of one faithful Jew and the other a pagan Gentile. But Arioch, of course, didn't see God in all of this. Only a man, only a captive from Judah. See, it couldn't be this captive from Judah's God that was doing this because our God had vanquished his God. Remember, we looked at that very thoroughly early on. Arioch only saw Daniel. But what does Scripture say? Let your light so shine before men. Matthew 5:16. Ahead of this, in verse 47, we will see that Daniel's witness will cause the king to worship Daniel's God. But here, in verse 26, the king's inquiry lets us know that the revealing of the dream before its interpretation must still happen. In verses 27 and 28, Daniel immediately gives the credit and the glory. He lets the king know that demonic world, the wisers of Babylon, that they're in contact with this demonic world, were unable to obtain this information, yet he could obtain it from his God. And they could never deliver what this dream was all about. Only the one true God of Israel, who was the author of the dream, and that he, Daniel, was merely a vessel of that delivery. The term Akhirit Hayamin literally means end of days, end of times, latter days. It's used only 14 times in all of Tanakh, in all of the Old Testament. In each instance, it means that closing period of the future is what this is talking about. And this is a relative term depending upon the context that it's used in, so its exact meaning can vary a little from place to place, having to do with context. Here it designates the period from the early 6th century BCE that this is going on with right now, all the way to the coming of Messiah, that period that Yeshua refers to in Luke 21:24 as the times of the Gentiles. The times of the Gentiles started here, right here with Daniel's revelation of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. Still in Daniel 2, verse 29, please. Your Majesty, when you were in bed, you began thinking about what would take place in the future, and he who reveals secrets has revealed to you what will happen. Yet this secret had not yet been revealed to me, because I am wiser than anyone living, but so that the meaning can be made known to your Majesty, then you can understand the thoughts in your mind. Next. Your Majesty had a vision of a statue. Remember that? We projected it early on. Had a vision of a statue. Very large and extremely bright. It stood in front of you, and its appearance was terrifying, at least to the king. The head of the statue was of fine gold. Its chest and arms silver. Trunk and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And as you watched a stone, now get this, we just changed a whole subject right here in this as to what the king saw. As you watched, a stone separated itself without any human hand, struck the statue on its feet made of iron, clay, and broke them into pieces. This statue talks about the entirety of time from this Nebuchadnezzar seeing this statue right down until Yeshua comes and tears up everything that's represented in this statue that represents all of the ages of the times of the Gentiles. As you watched a stone separate itself from any human hand, struck the statue on its feet, made of iron and clay, and broke them into pieces. Wow. This was an extraordinary revelation. This was an extraordinary revelation. It was given at the end of the 6th century. It was given at the end of the 6th century. Wow. Yet the empires that follow are described so accurately that the critics of the book of Daniel say that it would be impossible to predict what follows that accurately. That tells us something about the accuracy of the book of Daniel. This statue was a timeline of history, harping on this. From the head to the feet, and we're living right now in the time of the feet. We'll go into that in a whole lot of detail. We're living in the time of the feet. The king saw a great statue. Its size and its makeup indicating great power. Nebuchadnezzar was a great ruler, but he realized this represented something greater than himself. Remember in verses 1 through 3 it says, it troubled him in his spirit and he couldn't sleep. It gnawed at him to know what this really meant. In addition to its size and makeup, the statue must have had a great brilliance. The gold, the silver, freshly cast bronze has a brilliance. Freshly cast iron has a brilliance. It was dazzling. It was close to him. It looked large. It was right in front of him. And the dream would have made it personal. Dream would have made it personal. He couldn't understand it, and that would have made it terrifying. Made it terrifying. We fear the unknown. We fear the unknown. The statue in of itself was terrifying. Understand that Nebuchadnezzar was a man of war. Very little bothered that old boy. He was a man of war where there were battles where men hacked on each other with knives and axes, picturing a brutal horror as brutal as man can create. And the implication is that viewing this statue in his dream was enough to make this hardened man cringe before the incredible spectacle that he was seeing. This man that walked through battlefields of absolute carnage found this statue terrifying. Verse 31 gives us the effect the statue had on the king. Verse 32 through 33 describes the metallic character of the statue. Head of gold, chest and arms of silver, trunk and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, feet of iron and clay. This pictures the character of all the world empires between there, where that statue was in that dream, and the end of time. Note that the preciousness of the material deteriorates as we move from the top to the bottom. Gold at the top, clay at the feet. Note that the specific gravity decreases. Gold is 19, silver is 11, brass is 8.5, iron is 7.8, and also that the metals decrease in weight and increase in hardness as we move from the top to the bottom. Decrease in weight and increase in hardness. They become structurally more powerful. This fourth empire of man that we're in now, if we look at what's there in this nuclear age, there is infinitely so much more power here than there was in the time of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar, when they thought the big deal was to own a chariot and some horses and have a spear to throw. Actually, the image of our statue is top-heavy and weak in the feet. Verse 34, the king saw a stone, a rock, not cut by human hands. In other words, this came from God. Strike the feet of the statue. Then a rapid disintegration of the entire statue occurs, turns into tiny pieces that the wind blows away. It goes away completely. The empires of man, beginning with Babylon, cease at this point, because it will become the empire of God, governed by Yeshua Messiah. But the rock that hits it, after all these empires of man turn into nothing, that rock that hits it turns into a huge mountain and fills the whole earth. Verse 45 of this chapter, we're told that this stone separated itself from a mountain. In other words, this stone that's going to turn itself into the mountain separated itself from the mountain. It's speaking of God and His Messiah, and the Messiah returning to God. Here we see this was not by human hands. And we're going to get into this in some detail as we move forward from this time. This dream was couched in terms that this pagan Gentile king could understand immediately and know that it meant trouble. And also, it was couched in terms that he could immediately grasp that interpretation was needed and it was going to be coming. This mountain was one of those terms that he could understand. It was about the God of Israel, that he thought he, through his gods, had totally destroyed. We're going to stop here, and we'll pick this up again next week.